Hello, everyone, and welcome to week two in Drugs in Our Culture. This week, we're going to be talking about chapters 2 and 3. Specifically, what you will learn is how to contrast the reasons for drug use, look at the factors that have influenced the rate of drug use or how many people are using drugs, argue reasons for and against drug testing, evaluate the effects of drugs on family, academic achievements, and so forth. Differentiate between physiological, behavioral, acute, and chronic toxicity. Evaluate the trends of drug use, and you will use data from different surveys. Summarize how early attempts at regulating drugs came about. Create an argument how racism is a factor in drug regulation and enforcement. You will compare and contrast arguments for and against the legalization of drugs. And lastly, define drug decriminalization, drug legislation, and harm reduction. The assignments for this week are Emerging Trends Wiki, Drug Testing Blog. You'll have a Chapter 2 and 3 quiz, as well as a Chapter 3 Global Health Watch. You will choose a topic for your drug research paper, which is not due until the end of our course. However, it is time to start thinking about it as we will slowly work on the paper throughout our course. Of course, you'll have your discussion board, which again, your initial post is due on Wednesday, and your replies to your group members are due by Sunday, and then a journal, which I will talk about in a few minutes. The Emerging Trends assignment, the reason for it is really to provide you with resources on what types of drugs are emerging and what are the trends now with drug use, and analyze some of the emerging trends as it relates to society. And so the how you will complete this assignment is by visiting the National Institute on Drug Abuse website, and then you will click on Emerging Trends and Alerts, and you can find that under the Drugs of Abuse tab. Review the information provided on that page, and then in at least 200 words, describe the most disturbing emerging trends. So which one sort of stood out to you? Why do you think that was highlighted on this page, and how can having that information help the public? The next assignment is a drug testing blog, and the purpose of this assignment is for you to be able to consider the impact of drug testing in society, discuss the purposes of drug testing, so why would you do drug testing, and then create your own opinion whether regarding drug testing individuals for drugs. And so some of the things you can use to complete this assignment is your book and other internet resources, and then specifically choose one of the groups to research. So you don't need to address all of these groups, just choose one to address in your blog. And you can choose either students, athletes, school clubs, individuals and families that receive public assistance, and the workplace, or the workplace. And then after reading about drug testing for one of the groups I just mentioned, I would like you to create a bullet point list on the purpose for drug testing particular to that group. So what is the purpose of drug testing students, athletes, or the purpose of drug testing individuals and families that receive public assistance? Then I would like you to write about, do you feel drug testing this group is justified? So is there a good reason or good enough reason to drug test that particular group? And then do you feel drug testing is positive or negative regarding whatever group you're writing about? And so in at least 300 words after that bullet point list, I would like you to justify your answer and use references, whether it's the book or a web page, regarding whether or not you feel drug testing this group is positive or negative. Do the benefits outweigh the risks or not? So again, the drug research paper topic for this, all you are doing is selecting a topic, a drug on what you want to research, and tell me in a sentence or two why you want to research it. If you'd like to read more about the assignment, it is located on our Blackboard shell under course materials, and then you look under the drug research paper. Our discussion board this week is this. Many of the early attempts to regulate drugs were based on racism. Do you think racism involving drug regulation still exists today? Why or why not? And I want you to explain your opinion, but remember to use references. So don't just say, oh, I believe that drug regulation is racist. Okay, why? So use facts and data to support whatever your opinion is, and don't forget to cite those in your answer. And just a quick reminder to post your discussion board by Wednesday, write at least 2 paragraphs, make sure you're checking spelling and grammar, use references and cite them, and then you respond to all your group members by Sunday. Lastly, I'd like to talk about this individual journal area. This is an area for communication just between you and me. So it is private. Other students do not have access to your journal. It's just between you and me. And this grade is only for participation, right? So if you write to me, you get 5 points. If you don't write to me, you get 0. So it's really not about content. But what I'd like you to do is, be open and honest. It's really a way to kind of open the doors of communication between you and I, so we can work together to help you be successful in this course. And secondly, it does help me modify the course just to make it a better experience for all. So please be open and honest regarding your experience in this course. Are there any questions I can help you with, or any resources you need to be successful? Of course, you could ask questions about assignments and such, but I would prefer you ask questions about assignments in the class discussion board under Coffee House, because that way other students can see your questions and respond and answer. And if I answer the question, then other students have access to those answers. So it really becomes more of a classroom thing, and it doesn't really need to be private between us. So I'm going to read a couple of statements, and in your head, I want you, or you can say it out loud, of course, to decide whether or not the statement is true or false. The first, the most common drug for which people receive treatment for is alcohol. So is that true or false? It is true. Among people age 50 or older, 60% of those are in treatment for alcohol abuse. The elderly are less likely to misuse drugs compared to younger adults. True or false? It is false. Almost 20% of the elderly combine alcohol with prescription medicine. Drug abuse can cause one to develop a mental illness. True or false? It is false. While there is a relationship between drug abuse and mental illness, it is not clear whether a person was mentally ill, or people who are mentally ill turn to drugs to self-medicate, or abusing drugs can cause a mental illness. So you can't find causation there. There's just a relationship between the two. Drug awareness programs in the United States, such as DARE, raise a child's curiosity regarding drug use. True or false? This is true. And what research has shown is programs, especially like DARE, raise a child's curiosity so that maybe they would be more interested in trying or experimenting a drug after the program compared to before the program. Less than half of all high school students have used alcohol in the past year. True or false? This is false. Over half of all high school students have reported using alcohol in the past year. So this brings us to our lecture for this week. So risk factors are factors that play a role in whether an individual is more or less likely to use and abuse a drug. And these fall into 2 categories. So there are protective factors, and these are factors that reduce a person's risk for drug use. And then there are risk factors, and these are factors that increase a person's risk for drug use. And so here's a chart just that highlights some of the risk and protective factors. So risk factors, and again, these are factors that make it more likely a person will turn to drugs, are having lack of parental supervision, having poor social skills, having availability of drugs at school, community poverty, and then parental abuse of drugs. Protective factors are factors that protect people and reduce the chances of using drugs are having parental monitoring and support, having positive relationships, not only with peers, but also adults, having strong school anti-drug policies. There's a sense of neighborhood pride, and then parents reinforce the non-use of drugs. So the next few slides, I'm going to highlight reasons why people first turn to drugs. So the first is experimentation, where people are just curious about drug use, and this may lead to drug use. As I mentioned earlier, some drug awareness programs arouse interest and curiosity. In addition, media shows celebrities and well-known athletes using drugs, which also may arouse curiosity. And then some adolescents use drugs just due to poor impulse control. The area in the brain that controls rewarding behavior is more dominant during adolescence. And then the brain that controls inhibitory response is less dominant. So the part of the brain that tells you not to do something that may be bad is not as dominant during adolescence. It takes until your early 20s for that to fully develop. So these are bad. Two bad things going on with your brain during adolescence that make you more vulnerable to drugs. The next reason is pleasure or escape from boredom. So people like the feeling they get from drug use. It's that pleasure they enjoy. Drugs then become a source of reward, so your brain continues to want that sense of reward. And then there's also studies that show or suggest that the underdeveloped adolescent brain actually receives more pleasure from alcohol compared to the adult brain. So that drinking behavior, alcohol use behavior is actually more rewarding during adolescence than compared to adulthood. There's also research to suggest that the longer a person waits to try alcohol, so for example, if someone starts drinking at 16 compared to 21, the person at 16 has a much higher chance of the alcohol use developing into a disorder or a problem, whereas starting at 21, you see a much less chance of that turning into an alcohol use disorder. So the later one person waits to try alcohol or first use alcohol, the less likely their chances of having a problem with it are. So again, positive reinforcement is rewarding a positive behavior. So drugs are sometimes seen as a positive behavior. And then negative reinforcement is removing a negative stimuli. And so if someone's bored and they're using drugs to alleviate boredom, it's considered a negative reinforcement because you're taking away boredom. So you're taking away the negative stimuli. Peer influence is a strong influence for drug use, especially for adolescents. It's the greatest influence in their lives or how their peers perceive them. Adolescents attribute marijuana and alcohol use with increased popularity. And even young adults tend to be highly influenced by their peers. So when you look at colleges, members of sororities and fraternities, we're found to have significantly higher rates of alcohol use compared to those who are not members of sororities and fraternities. Spiritual purposes. So really throughout history, drug use has played a role in enhanced spirituality. Some religions still use drugs as part of their rituals and ceremonies. And you have this sort of two-sided coin. So being involved with an organized religion can be seen as having a protective role in drug use and abuse. It's part of the recovery aid for substance abusers. However, in many religions, drugs are part of their ceremony. So think about alcohol, right? It is part of ceremonies for Christianity, Judaism, the two main religions. And so what you see is even though that being part of that religion can be a protective factor, they also utilize drugs in that religion. Other religions have utilized psychedelics to enhance spirituality. When I think of some of the Native American religions, the use of peyote, ayahuasca, things like that to enhance spirituality. Social interaction, so sometimes called a social lubricants. Drugs are sometimes used to help facilitate social interaction. So if you're nervous being in crowded places or new places around people, sometimes people take drugs to make those situations easier. And then rebelliousness, to rebel. Sometimes people take drugs because they're told not to. So there is a strong relationship between drug use and recklessness, as well as pre-delinquent behavior. So adolescents who demonstrate oppositional behavior are more likely to engage in drug use. When we look at the influence of drug use, why are some people more likely to use drugs than others? So in this center of the circle is the individual, so the person. And then you can see their close circle around them are the most influential, so personality traits, attitudes and beliefs, interpersonal and peer resistance skills, and genetics. The next circle are a little further out, so your community, your peers, school policy, local law enforcement, personal situations, parents. And then finally, we have the larger circle around, which is more societal. So what's the cost of alcohol and other drugs, marketing of alcohol, the portrayal of alcohol, tobacco, drugs, and TV and movies and social media. How hard or easy is it to get those drugs? So what's the minimum purchase, age of purchase for alcohol? And then federal laws regarding alcohol and drugs. So we look at drug dependency versus drug addiction. So drug dependency is where your body adjusts to the presence of a substance and will show withdrawal symptoms if the drug is discontinued. Continual use of a drug, your body gets used to the presence of the drug and will adjust accordingly. Addiction, on the other hand, is a complex disease that impacts the brain. Drug addiction changes the brain's functioning and physical structure, which may be long-lasting. So can you think of a situation where one may be drug dependent, so their body has adjusted to the presence of the drug, but not drug addicted? Or a situation or where one may be drug addicted, but not dependent? I'll give you a second to think about that. So here are some examples. A person who is prescribed Vicodin to deal with chronic back pain. The person may not be addicted to the drug, but also may experience withdrawal symptoms when discontinuing the drug. That's one example where a person may be dependent, but not addicted. Now let's go the other way. An example where a person may be addicted, but not dependent. So consider a person who is addicted to gambling. While there may not be withdrawal symptoms when discontinuing the behavior, they're acting in a compulsive manner and are considered addicted to gambling, where gambling has changed the brain's functioning and physical structure, but their body will not go through withdrawal because there's not a physical substance you're putting in your body. When we look at early drug regulations, or early regulations, there are some that argue, what is the first form of drug regulation? And they will say, oh, it's from the Bible, right? Adam and Eve, don't eat the apple. And what do? They eat the apple. So that's one example. But really, in a U.S. history, when we're going to talk about the early drug regulations, in 1791, Congress passed a tax on whiskey to help generate income. So the country is very new at this point, right? 1776. And at the time, Pennsylvania farmers were really opposed to this tax. They felt it was unfair. It was going to cut into their livelihood. And this was really the first act as a country to show that we are a unified country and we can do things to make sure you follow our law. So at the time, this was President George Washington sent in the militia to squash this rebellion. It was called the Whiskey Rebellion. And it really showed that we were a country. This was sort of a test. Can the nation back up what they're trying to do? And obviously it did. Then we have opium. In 1833, the U.S. signed its first treaty regulating the opium trade. About 10 years later, they imposed a federal tax on crude opium. And during this time, a large number of Chinese workers were coming to the U.S. to work on the railroad, which led to a lot of fear and hostility to the Chinese. Anytime in U.S. history where you see an influx of immigration, it tends to lead to nervousness, more racism, more fear against whatever group is coming in. So during this time, it was the Chinese. So then in 1890, the U.S. only allowed U.S. citizens to manufacture and import opium, as before it was coming in with the Chinese. So you sort of see here the first regulations that really were tied to racism. And then we have in the 1800s this idea of patent medicine, where proprietary drugs were called patent medicine, were sold for every possible reason. And so there were these traveling salespeople with their special patent medicine brew that were guaranteed to cure everything from like earache to headaches to menstrual cramps to depression. I mean, these were miracle drugs, essentially. So during this time, it was considered the golden era of patent medicines. These patent medicine sellers were making a ton of money. However, these drugs were there was no regulation of buying drugs, so totally not regulated. They were untested. They were promoted as cures for morphine, alcohol addiction. Many of them are reported as non-addicting. However, they contained heroin, alcohol, opiates, and cocaine. And they were given to children as well. I mean, you didn't know what was in them. You didn't know it was unsafe. And they were just handing them out, making a ton of money. So this led to the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. And so this really allows the first time the government to enter the drug marketplace. And what this law required is that drug manufacturers or the patent medicine people were required to state what the ingredients of the drug were on the drug label. So they had to be honest about what was in their special formula. And then about 10 years later, the beginning of the 20th century, there was a lot of concern regarding opiate dependency. And so this led to the passing of the Harrison Act of 1914. And the purpose was to govern the marketing and sale of narcotics. So before you could get narcotics, you can just get them. What this allowed, or what this mandated, is that doctors had to prescribe to give out narcotics. So now had to go through a doctor. Doctors were required to register each year to be able to prescribe narcotics, and they were to pay a fee. And then doctors and pharmacists had to keep a record of prescriptions. What some believe is that this law may have been counterproductive, because now that narcotics were not freely available, for those people that didn't have access to doctors or pharmacies or money to get it that way, they would turn now to other drugs. And so when the people went through withdrawal, they had to resort to criminal activity to obtain the drug. A little later, we have our Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938. So during this time, what this says is that pharmaceutical companies had to file applications now with the federal government, demonstrating that the new drug was safe and properly labeled. So what it did not do, it did not cover drugs that were previously marketed, so those had free reign. Drugs had to be proven safe, but not effective. So the main concern here was safety. There was little authority to enact penalties. So let's say a drug was not safe, the government really did not have a lot of power to do anything about that. In addition, the drug manufacturers were the ones who were given responsibility for determining whether to require a prescription for the drug or make it available over the counter. Now, if you're a drug manufacturer and you have that option, should I make someone have a prescription for this drug, or should I allow people to get it freely? The obvious choice is to allow people to get it freely, because then more people have access to it and more people will buy it, so you make more money. And then also the drug manufacturers create their own tests to determine if the drug was effective or not. So obviously it might have been a little skewed to show that this drug is effective and a miracle drug. A little bit after this, we have the Kefauver-Harris Amendment. And what happened here was many babies were being born with these deformed limbs, as you can see from the photos here, due to the drug thalidomide. And so this really, the purpose of this amendment was to get the government more power in its ability to regulate new and existing drugs, right? So not just new drugs, now they can go back and look at existing drugs. The government now had the ability to withdraw drugs from the marketplace to make them unavailable. Drug advertisements directed at physicians had to include a list of side effects. And the drug manufacturers were still responsible for drug testing, but the procedure they used for drug testing had to be approved by the FDA. All right. A bit long later on, we have the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970. And this was also called the Controlled Substance Act. And the initial purpose of this was to focus on rehabilitation, research, and education. It clearly stated that the federal government takes precedence over state laws. And so over here I write a question. Can you think of a situation where this would apply today, where state laws be different from federal laws regarding a drug? And if you guessed marijuana, you are correct. Many states are now legalizing not only medicinal marijuana, but also recreational marijuana. However, the federal government still says that drug is illegal. So what does this mean? It means regardless, the federal government can go to any state if they choose and arrest people for using marijuana, for selling marijuana, because federal law takes precedence takes power over state law. All right, going back to the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970. And what this did is divide drugs into 5 categories, and these categories are called schedules. And this is the criteria to determine where a drug's schedule labeling, where it goes. The drug's potential for abuse, the scientific knowledge of the drug's capacity to produce psychic or physical dependence, the drug's risk to public health, and the drug's pattern of abuse. And it goes from 1 to 5, 1 being the worst drug out there, and 5 being like the least risk drug. So here are the drug schedules, 1 through 5. I just put a couple examples here to give you an idea. But so Schedule 1 is a high potential for abuse, no medical reasons whatsoever. They cannot be prescribed. There is no reason a person can use this drug. Cannot do tests on them. And examples are heroin. Okay, makes sense. LSD, marijuana. So the federal government puts marijuana on the same drug schedule as heroin. Think about that. We're going to talk a lot more about that in depth when we talk about marijuana, but I do want you to think about that. Okay, then you have category 2, potential for abuse, very high. Now there's some medicinal uses for it federally. We're talking about federal law here. And here we have cocaine, methamphetamine, methadone, hydromorphone, oxycodone, fentanyl, right? These are pretty serious drugs, and yet somehow the federal government says these are less risky compared to marijuana. Then you have Schedules 3, where there's some potential for abuse. There's medicinal use, and you can see some of the examples here. Schedule 4 is low potential for abuse. It's less than Schedule 3. Medicinal use, you have like Xanax, Darvocet, Valium, etc. And then Schedule 5 is low potential for abuse. It's less than Schedule 4. Yes, there's medicinal use. And here's where you see like cough medicine with codeine, which is like the Robitussin AC. So as you can see, those are the least risky. So I've mentioned earlier that this idea that the early drug enforcement policies were racist. And so really since history, the war on drugs is marred by these racial overtones. People of color are stopped and searched more often in airports, bus depots, train stations, and on state highways. Black youth are 7 times more likely to be arrested for smoking marijuana or selling drugs compared to white youth. And then I sometimes have people in class when I'm teaching this face-to-face say, oh, well, that's because Black people are more likely to use drugs than white people or sell drugs. And the answer is no, they're not. Actually, it's exactly the same. So percentage-wise, it's exactly the same. The percent of Black people who use drugs is the exact same as the percentage of white people who use drugs. But when you look at in the proportions in the population, there are more white people. So one would imagine that more white people would be arrested, stopped by a policeman. But no, even with there are more white people and more white people selling drugs, Black youth are still sometimes more likely to be stopped and arrested. And then we have these early ideas of crack cocaine and powder cocaine. So I want you to consider that this is the exact same drug. It's a different format. But if you break it down molecularly, exact same drug, crack cocaine and powder cocaine, still cocaine. So crack cocaine is more likely to be used by poor people and people of color. Powder cocaine, I should write, is more likely to be used by middle class people or higher class people. However, even to this day, crack cocaine has much stiffer penalties compared to powder cocaine, even though it is the exact same drug. This concludes our PowerPoint for this week. I hope you have a wonderful week, and as always, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me.